Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Euractiv online event, which is kindly supported by Iberdrola. My name is Frédéric Simon. I'm the Energy and Environment Editor of Euractiv, and I'm delighted to be hosting this discussion today about the decarbonisation of energy and how the European Commission's recently presented recovery plan could be used as a springboard to reach the EU's 2050 climate neutrality goal. And we'll start this online event with a presentation by Richard Sarsfield-Hall from A3 Management Consulting. Richard will outline a roadmap for a zero-emission EU energy system by 2050, a report that A3 produced recently for Iberdrola. Then we'll turn to our two speakers, starting with Arthur Runge-Metzger, Director at the European Commission's DG Klima. Arthur kindly accepted to replace Mauro Petriccione, the Director General, who had to cancel his participation at the last minute yesterday because of an urgent cabinet meeting. So thank you once again, Arthur, for stepping in. And to close the initial round of opening statements, we will turn to Martin Porter from the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership in Brussels, who will share his views on the energy transition and the recovery plan. So welcome to all of you for joining us today. After the opening statements, we will move on to a Q&A session that will also include questions from the audience. To ask a question for the online participants, just click on the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of your screen of your Zoom page, and put your question in writing. I'll try and take as many of them as possible. And I think that's all for me. So without further ado, Richard Sarsfield-Hall, the floor is yours now for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much indeed, Frederick. So first of all, I'd like to thank Euractiv and Iberdrola for asking us to share the output of a study that we participated. So first of all, for those of you who've never heard of A3, we used to be known as Pori Management Consulting. Last year, Pori was merged with a Swedish company called UF that you can see there within our logo. And then, so we came up with a new brand name for the two companies called A3. The A3 Management Consulting Division remains pretty much the same as it was before, concentrating on various things. And in particular, I have been leading the work when we've been thinking about how to decarbonize the energy system. So a brief introduction to that, which will be to say, so we've been looking at decarbonisation. I've been looking at it actually all the way back since 2010, so quite a long time now. And more recently, we published back in 2018 a major multi-client study that looked at how you decarbonise and looking at it by two main pathways, sort of the so-called all-electric, which is the way you look to electrify everything within transport, heat, industry, and the power system, or where you allow at least some zero carbon gases to compete. So that includes carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, biomethane, and to do all of that. What was really interesting that came out of all of that was that one of the key prerequisites for such a study was that you need to deliver smart grids. So there's quite an expansion of electric demand in both pathways, and that you need those to be smart, because that then allows some mutually supportive elements to happen with flexible charging, flexible heat across the day to help to do that. And another major insight that came from the original study was the need for expansion of interconnections to make sure you maximize the capture of weather patterns as they move across geographies. So you're generating not only for the geography you're in, but you're generating for the country behind you and the country in front of you as the system balances itself out. So the main policy message that came out of all of that is how critical it is to keep the different options open, because if you start precluding one technology over another, then you certainly increase the risks, you definitely increase the costs, and it makes the security supply benefits that you could get from the mutually supportive element even more of a challenge to get there by 2050. Of course, that's just two pathways. Of course, there are many, many other ways of getting there. And that's the work that we did for Iberdrola. You can see the front cover of the report there. And I'm just going to give you a quick summary of the main messages that came through from that report. So when we look at how you decarbonize, and this is done on a cost optimization process where you least cost, taking into account many, many different factors. So obviously the cost of building renewables, the cost of converting people's homes from one heating system to another system, the cost of building new grids, cost of converting gas networks if appropriate, installing any carbon capture and storage system, etc. So all of that needs to be part of the mix. And what you see is as an energy system that goes in this particular pathway with some fairly significant expansions of electrification. So if we start first of all in the non-process heat, so that's mostly space heating in residential, commercial, and hot water, then what you find with that is that because of the pathway here, where we were assuming fairly significant improvements in air source heat pump efficiencies in particular, then across a lot of Europe, this is Europe-wide results here, and you see a fairly significant expansion of electrification. You still see a little bit of biomethane and some hydrogen hybrid boiler systems where you have a heat pump and a hydrogen boiler to take away some of that core peak electricity. That's very important, and that gets on that. When we look at process heat, which is obviously industry, then we see electrification, especially in the low temperature heat. And then we see a fairly significant expansion of a mixture of some gas CCS, especially where you've got process emissions, and those process emissions need to be captured alongside, therefore, the heat element of the CO2 that comes out from that. And again, some hydrogen on that basis. On the transport system, we see a massive move to electrification, pretty consistent with, I think, everybody's view that there's going to be a lot of electric cars. And then you see a little bit of hydrogen at the bottom there by the time you get to 2050, primarily for the very heavy good vehicle segment. Although even in this pathway, we incorporated some concepts of e-highways where you have overhead wires going along the motorway to facilitate movements of some of the heavy goods materials around. And then, as I said earlier, a power generation system that becomes very, very dominated by renewables. So this ability with interconnectors to transfer and move energy around enables you to give a very, very high level system on that basis. And what does this mean then in terms of the outcome? So this cheaper renewables gives you a system where you have a lot more electrification across the system. So there's a big expansion, hence reinforcing my point about the need for smart grids. And we actually find ourselves, so in this particular study and for Iberdrola, we were able to get to a 59% reduction by 2030. Now, this is not because we superimposed what was actually being set as a target for 2030 economy-wide or anything like that. It just shows that to get to the end game, you have actually got to be on that pathway already. So it's not optional. You need to be on that pathway to get you to the end game, to be zero emissions by 2050. There's a bit of a canter through, obviously, which is a much bigger report. Those are the main messages, and I hope that gives some insights and some thoughts for people, both for questions and for the discussion with the panel.
Thank you, Richard. These are really useful, and no doubt there will be plenty of questions later on. Artur Rungemexger, maybe you can share some of your own initial thoughts now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me at short notice. We think that this is an interesting report that Richard just presented. And I think what it shows is, if you compare it with the long-term strategy that the Commission has been doing and publishing a bit more than a year ago, that we know the types of technologies that are going to help us in terms of decarbonization of the energy system. And I don't think there is a huge difference between what Richard's group was doing and what we have been doing in the Commission, and what is also being the kind of the basic blueprint for the European Green Deal. It shows in the different sectors which technologies are part of the solution, and these technologies we will have to deploy at scale in the coming years. And I think what is also clear from Richard's graphs is that there is probably various pathways, and there is a transition over time on how you get there. So you're not going to start with the year 2050 in terms of the energy mix or the technology mix, but that this will have to be a managed transformation over time. And I think that's very important to keep in mind when we are looking at the exact pathways. Another interesting observation is when Richard said at the end, you get down to 59% reductions in carbon in the energy sector, and that would be the logical percentage. This is something, as you know, we will be looking at the present point in time in the context of the European Green Deal to see whether now that Europe has embraced the climate neutrality by 2050, we will have to review the 2030 target. And the numbers we are looking at, I think everybody knows them by heart by now, minus 50%, minus 55% greenhouse gas emission reductions across all sectors, of course, not just the energy system. So I think that is going to be an interesting exercise also in terms of the results. And I presume that many of the results Richard has been showing will also be coming out in our own analysis in the coming months.
Thank you, Arthur, for sharing those thoughts. Martin Porter, the view from your side now.
Thank you, and my thanks also to Euractiv and to my colleagues for the invitation to join you here. I would also reiterate some of the points that Arthur just made with respect to the study, because I think if we look at it in the context of the Green Deal, it confirms, broadly speaking, the direction and the rationale for the direction which is being taken. It outlines a pathway to energy decarbonisation, which is cost optimal, I think, as Richard put it. That was the basis for the study, and shows that with a mix of technologies, even if it's electrification led, then we can see that this is the way to achieve full decarbonisation of the energy sector. And I think to pick up on Arthur's point, de facto that results in approximately at least 55% for the whole economy. Maybe Richard can pick up on that as an implication in due course. So it reinforces the notion that this is a growth strategy as much as just a decarbonisation strategy. And within that, clearly you can see regional as well as technology variations. There are some technologies which Richard set out which are more effective in certain climates and geographies than others, and clearly the regional differentiation is going to be an important part of that overall approach too. Just a couple of other observations, I think, in relation particularly to the discussion about the recovery plan. One particularly in relation to the social dimension of this study in that context, and another on industrial dimensions to it. On the social side of this, I think it's important to look at where these energy technologies can be driven in the short term, also because they will lead to employment being generated rapidly and effectively in some of these areas. They need deployment with the right skills and with the right capacities, but they can deliver not just the decarbonisation goal, but also potentially rapid increase in areas of the economy which are in need of employment boost in the short term. And it would be useful to talk that point through. This is an area that CISL has also looked at recently in a separate study, and I think it confirms these trends and why investment in these technologies has that twin benefit. The second is the industrial dimension to this. There is a parallel industrial strategy discussion which is taking place in addition or in the context of the Green Deal. And these are also energy technologies that sit alongside industrial technologies, mobility technologies, as Richard set out, where there is high potential to invest with significant return for competitive advantage within Europe. They can not only increase resilience of the energy system and of the European economy, but they can also lead to the development of expertise, value chains, and capacity for the rollout of these technologies, not just in Europe, but internationally, which is in Europe's interest, but ultimately, obviously, in a global benefit as well. So exploring a little bit the way in which industrial strategy also sits alongside these energy strategies is going to be an important dimension. Maybe one last point, if I may, Fred, before we turn back to Richard. In addition to these technologies that you highlight in the study, certainly in terms of the recovery, it's very important that investment is directed towards them, but specifically towards those which support the Green Deal and those which do not, therefore go against the conclusions of this study. So making those choices and making sure the mechanisms are in place to ensure those choices are followed through is as important as highlighting where we need to spend the right money in the short term. So those are my initial comments.
Thanks very much, Martin, also for placing the emphasis on the recovery plan that the Commission presented now almost 2 weeks ago. And let me turn immediately to Arthur Runge-Metzger, because with the recovery plan, there was a lot of expectation that some of the money would be reserved for specific programs on renewables, on hydrogen, on building renovation, and so on. And in the end, there was no such thing in the recovery plan. It was all more about the governance in terms of how this is managed by the member states, and also the whole idea of borrowing on the markets. So Arthur, maybe can you tell us a few things about the programs? Is there going to be something coming out of the European Commission in the coming months to sort of explain in detail and lay out in detail how the money from the recovery fund will be used?
Frederick, thanks for this. This is an important question, and I have been hearing that question from many parts in Brussels and also in member states. It is true that the recovery relies a lot on the proposals of member states. The biggest chunk of money is going to be channeled via member states' budgets. So that is the recovery facility that has been proposed. But of course, member states in their own programs should focus on the right things. And I think I can just give as an example that member states over the last 24 months were very busy in drafting their national energy and climate plans in order to support the transition at the level of member states. And many of the programs that are necessary and that Richard was referring to, and also Martin, like for instance, investing into renewables, make sure that we are not stopping that investment because companies fall into liquidity traps or in terms of cash they have available. Also to support the renovation wave that is being foreseen under the Green Deal. And then I think the big transition that we see in the mobility sector, where the technologies are ready, where they are close to being competitive in terms of prices. And these are areas that have been described in the national energy and climate plans by member states. And the money that comes from the recovery can be used for that. So that's the first strand. Then there's a second strand that goes straight to supporting industry or supporting municipalities. And that is all around the InvestEU program. The InvestEU program is practically on the table. And it has, Frederick, all these elements that you have been mentioning already in the program as possibilities that can be supported. And this InvestEU facility is being ramped up with additional money from recovery. And that is going to mobilize a lot more money in the private sector. So this can, for instance, help, again, when it comes to renovation, whether it is cities trying to renovate their schools and hospitals, or whether it is even private homeowners. It can help industry in moving forward on the clean technologies. Take automotive industry, investments into big battery plants that are required if we want to get to scale in the rollout of electric mobility in the coming years. So you can go through all the different programs you have been mentioning, and you will find a slot in the overarching infrastructure. And it has also, as a third window, an increase in Horizon Europe money. Because many of the technologies that Richard also was mentioning and that Martin was referring to, whether it is hydrogen, whether it is CCS, these are not going to be deployed at carbon prices between 20, 30, or even 40 euros per ton of carbon dioxide. We will need to ramp them up, and we need to have like lighthouse projects in these areas to make sure that we can drive down the cost of technologies in these areas so that they are deployable at scale during the course of the next 10 to 20 years. So it's preparing also for particularly the industrial transition Martin was referring to. Green steel is not something where you have the plant already during the recovery period, which is hopefully as short as possible in the next 2 years, but that is going to come later. But we can lay the foundation for these breakthrough technologies, and that is an important part of the recovery program, but not the biggest part, because it's not going to be as impactful in terms of jobs and economic stimuli in the short term, in the next 2 years.
Right, thank you, Arthur, for those details. But so if I understand correctly, there's a great deal of flexibility in the way the member states will design their programs. They can really pick and choose, right? I mean, some of them might decide to invest heavily on e-mobility, for example. Others might choose to invest more in building renovation. It's really up to them to decide the kind of policy mix that they want to put in place for their own countries. Is that right?
Yes, as long as they stick to the direction of travel.
Yeah. The other two speakers, maybe a few thoughts on that. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of leeway now for member states to design their own policies. Do you think that's a good idea, or should the EU be more directive in the way it designs those recovery programs? What do you think? What's the right mix between flexibility on the one hand and the need to have clear programs on the other? And maybe Martin Porter, you can say a few words about that.
Thank you. Well, I think we have at the moment quite a good balance. As Arthur said, the broad direction has been set within the context of the Green Deal, the climate neutrality goal by 2050, and within that there is scope for national plans to be developed, which have these flexibilities built into them effectively. There are some specific targets and de facto, therefore, constraints on that. But there is a large degree of flexibility that you can see even within the recovery packages that have been announced only in the last week or so. Interestingly, also from Poland, and you see Hungary now, as well as countries like France and Germany, significant investments being directed, as you say, maybe not all to exactly the same endpoints, but in the same broad direction, as Arthur said. So whether it is in hydrogen, electric vehicles, heat pumps, solar power, offshore wind, the mix differs, but the general sense of direction is compatible with the Green Deal intentions. Whether it is yet sufficient, I think is obviously a question we will keep coming back to. There is still a gap between the emissions reduction goals we have and what we are seeing in practice. But nonetheless, there is momentum here, and the recovery packages, with the flexibility that they have, give member states the chance to see how they can develop their own industries and businesses without that feeling as if it's imposed on them from above. They obviously have that context, but they have a lot of discretion to build industries in their own countries. But many of these actually need to be developed cross-regionally. Many of the countries have natural industry infrastructures which are cross-border, and they need to exploit those. Some of the infrastructure necessary for offshore wind, for example, naturally involves a number of countries. Some of the industrial developments in Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, for example, are naturally ones that need to be designed together. So there is a lot of incentive to collaborate, but at the same time, I think the flexibility remains within the scope of member states to target particular objectives as they see fit.
But maybe staying with you for a bit, Martin, are there, in your view, some priority sectors for recovery spending? You know, those which bring, in your view, the most value for money, and that could accelerate the energy transition? Are there any obvious sectors that stand out?
Well, I think there've been a number of studies looking at what would be the best areas to invest in from that perspective. They aren't only about value for money, because there is also the question of how quickly employment can be regenerated in some areas, as much as long-term value for money. So the point that Arthur made about infrastructure investment, for example, the returns that we will see there will come over a longer period of time, perhaps, than we would see, for example, in compared to buildings renovation, where there is a very high potential for more rapid increase in employment, as long as we have the ability to find the right skills and to deploy them in the right places. I think that there is a need to reskill and to retrain and ensure the expertise is available in the right places. But the return on investment in the renovation area is clear, I think, in the short as well as the longer term. It also has, obviously, the climate benefit. And in many of these areas, of course, there are adjacent health benefits from clean air and other issues as well, which should be factored in to the cost calculation. So I think the distinction is between those areas which have short-term benefit, both economically and socially, and those which are necessary as part of the transition over a 20, 30-year time frame, where investment in infrastructure is necessary, whether that could be hydrogen, it could be areas related to CCS, for example, smart grids and interconnections that Richard mentioned. They all have the potential to deliver return on investment, but over different timescales.
Thanks for that. Richard Sarsfield-Hall, your view maybe on the priority sectors, because I mean, one of the things that stood out from your report is the great deal of effort that must be done on the electrification side. And you did point out to the need to build some more flexibility in the electricity system. So what are the priority areas that you would put?
So first of all, when we think about things like transport, you know, if you look at the stated ambition from people like Toyota, Honda, other major manufacturers, you know, with 70% being their expectation of number of new sales of electric vehicles by 2030, you know, globally, you know, if you're deploying that level, that's consistent with the level of new electric vehicles needed in our pathways. So you could say transport and the incentives both from the manufacturers and whether anything else is done in parallel will happen anyway. So because of the tightening of the emission standards, etc. So I think transport is one area where there's probably already a lot done and you probably don't need to do any more. It's decarbonising of heat, which is the big challenge. So, you know, and this is where it will vary by geography, and people need to remember. So, you know, I hear a lot of people talking about electrification or hydrogen. What's really important here is to remember it's about decarbonisation. So it's about what works for your country, what works for your geography, what works for your existing infrastructure. So there's no point sort of saying, well, we're going to decarbonize with a lot of electrification and then not spend any money on getting the grids up to standard, getting the smart element within that. Because if you do that, then all that happens is you then just make the risk of the electric supply and demand not working and power cuts, and then you get a bad reputation, and people suddenly go, hold it, this is not working. This is, all of those problems. My wife is South African, so I know all about when I go there of random cuts to electricity. So that's a good example of where you get it wrong. The system can be very, very disruptive. So it's definitely making sure, and it's to a certain extent, it's not just about, well, what do we need to trial, and we need to take years to evaluate. If we're not deploying at scale by 2030 in heat, that's never going to work. And if you were saying we need a lot of skilled people, there's new homes being built, a lot of
Richard, I think you're having connection issues. Maybe we'll return to you in a minute. We couldn't hear the last couple of sentences that you were saying, but we'll come back to you in a minute. Okay. Let me come back now to the other speakers about the timeframes, because this is something that comes up regularly in those discussions about the recovery plan, how you can reconcile, on the one hand, the need for short-term economic stimulus that's also consistent with very long decarbonisation timeframe. We're aiming for 2050 decarbonisation. So what are again, the sectors, the areas where you can sort of hit two birds with one stone? Are there obvious areas there as well? Maybe I can turn to you, Arthur Runge-Metzger, for that.
Yes, and I think, yes, there is a number of obvious areas where you have, on one hand, the short-term benefit to stimulate the economy, and at the same time, you're doing the right thing, because this is exactly what we will need to get to decarbonisation and climate neutrality by the year 2050. One of those areas is the energy efficiency and the renovation of buildings. That is going to have a major implication immediately onto the labor market. Most of the technologies that are required either to insulate your house, to bring green electricity to the houses, is already there. Also in terms of digitalization, in order to manage your heating, your electricity at home better, these are available. So these can have immediate impacts. The same I see with renewable energy, because building windmills, even building solar panels and get them out is going to create a lot of jobs. And is going to be an immediate stimulus in the economy. And it goes even further into your industrial sectors, because windmills, as you know, will need steel in order to be built, will need concrete in order to be built. So you also have knock-on effects across the entire value chain. And that's also true when you look at mobility. And maybe there I would disagree a little bit with Richard, because I think in order to create the preconditions that the dreams of the car manufacturers become true, we need to have the right infrastructure in place. And this is one thing we have been mentioning very clearly in the Green Deal, that we need to roll out the infrastructure when it comes to electricity. So that brings us back also to Richard's point on making sure that the grids are in the right spot in the coming years. And there's a lot that needs to be done to make sure that this electrification that will have to happen is going to happen. I think that is an area where in the next 10 years you will have to invest. But then also the circular economy. Batteries is something we have been talking about. If we want to see the massive rollout of batteries, recycling must happen. So that is an area where investments in new industries in Europe in the coming years can move us into the right direction. There is still a number of gigafactories for batteries that is going to be required. So that is also an area of investment. And finally, I think we always talk about industry and about urban areas. We also should think of agriculture. And here again, there's one big area I think that has not been really tapped, and that's, for instance, the production of biogas in order to reduce methane emissions. So renewable energy in the farming areas is something that can be supported today, that can be rolled out today, has immediate impacts on growth, it has impacts on jobs. So it will have the short-term and the long-term benefit. And I think there's many more areas that could be identified where we can make these investments that are going to be impactful.
Right. So if I understand correctly, Arthur, what you're saying is that the countries that will come up with plans which prioritize the areas that you just mentioned, those will receive, in a way, the highest grades. I mean, they will take all of the boxes. And if they do, there's a higher chance that their plan will be approved, because there's a review that will have to take place at some point, which is going to be done jointly by the Commission and the member states. So those that tick all the boxes that you mentioned have a high chance of receiving approval, correct?
Yes, that is correct. And I think, as I mentioned before, member states are not starting from scratch, because they have just gone through this exercise to say, what are the investments we require in order to get to our climate targets in the year 2030? So the basic work has been done in member states. I think what needs to be done now is maybe to scrutinize this list and say, which are the ones which are most impactful in the short term? Because when we talk about recovery, we talk about the year 21, the year 22. So these are things that probably should already be in the drawer in terms of the project outline, the program outline that is there. I don't think we can lose a lot of time in inventing or reinventing the wheel in that respect and waiting for the investment plans. I think things need to come out of the drawer. I think that is important in order to fast forward the whole transition towards climate neutrality.
Yeah. A related question with all that you said, the three of you, is also to find a balance between technologies which are already mature and ready, like wind and solar and renovation, and those which need long-term developments, such as hydrogen, CCS, etc. What sort of balance do you think should be struck there? Martin Porter, maybe you can share a few thoughts on that.
Yes, well, one level, there isn't so much an either-or choice. We need to do both. We need to, as well as the short term employment, and we can see from the short term in investments. I think, therefore, it's a false choice in the rule. We need to time for investment arise in how to stimulate with the goal in mind at the end that should predominantly green hydrogen, but without necessarily constraining that growth in the short term by putting conditions that meet as quickly as we need it to. So there are questions that we need to scaling that give the industries associated the opportunity to develop, but without necessarily, if you want, locking us into long-term outcomes which are inconsistent with what we have in mind in the Green Deal.
Okay, thanks, Martin. I'm afraid the line is not perfect on your end either, so we lost a few of your sentences there. But I do get a sense also from the conversations that we had just before the event that there's also a risk with the recovery fund that maybe some speculative bubbles could be created. I mean, we've seen in Spain with the solar panels a few years back, and also in the construction sector, that when you have a lot of government support for particular areas, you also run a risk of fueling speculative bubbles. Is that a risk now, you think, with the recovery fund? And Arthur Runge-Metzger, maybe you can say a few words about that?
I think we have been learning quite a lot in terms of policy making when it comes to the energy and the climate transition over the past 15 years in Europe. And clearly we have seen sometimes policy environments turning around very quickly. And I think it was particularly when you look back on the solar side and the renewables in the aftermath of the last financial crisis. And the problem there was that, of course, everybody is looking into his and her own pocket and saying, oh, maybe this crisis is going to dry my pocket up and I can no longer invest. And I think that was the case in the last financial crisis. So governments no longer could afford the policies that they had been setting. And I think this is something that we need to avoid this time around. And I think if you look at the proposal that is on the table from the side of the Commission and add it to all the things member states want to do, in terms of the firepower that is there, we want to try to fill these gaps that might occur, not only in the public sector in member states, but also in the private sector. And I think in that respect, the recovery program at the EU level will play a very important role, because there is this element that is very strong in there, that is solidarity. Because different member states are not only having different starting points, but they have also gotten to a very different extent into the depth of the crisis. So they will need tailored support in terms of their national circumstances. So you will see that the largest part of the funding that is available under the recovery facility will be going to the member states that are weaker in terms of their public finance, in order to make sure that they don't have to roll back many of the policies that they have been announcing. And there's, if you know, Spain, for instance, has set itself a very ambitious plan in terms of the energy and the climate transition. I think they will require assistance from the EU level in order to be able to carry through those plans. And that is something that we should make possible from the side of the EU. I think there's also a question which I just picked up from the audience. The way we see it in terms of the whole recovery is that it really needs to support in its entirety the transition and the transformation into the future. And that is the green, and that's also the digital transition. And that has also to do with improving the strategic autonomy of the European Union. So there should be the principle of no harm that has been mentioned very often, applied across the board. So we should not fund investments or policies that would try to take us into the opposite direction. I think that must be excluded. The money that is going to be spent, we can only spend it once. And if it is spent, there comes the time of repayment. So we cannot invest in what could be a stranded asset in the future. So Instead of talking about speculative bubbles, my bigger fear is stranded assets, that we make sure we are not supporting investments in areas that are then defunct in 10 or 15 years' time.
That's a good point. Maybe the other two, Martin, about stranded assets on one hand, and maybe the risk of fueling a speculative bubble. Martin, can you say a few words about this, hoping the connection this time is good?
I hope so as well. Yes, clearly, I agree completely with what Arthur just said. It's very important. We're at a remarkable moment with the amount of public funding to leverage private funding at the same time that could be directed towards what we've been talking about here, the subjects in Richard's study, for example, and others that we've mentioned. But it isn't automatically going to go to the right places. And there is, of course, an increasingly sort of high risk that we will have stranded assets if we don't put those investments in the right places now, because it could happen very rapidly over the next 10 years or so that we see a shift in the balance of those risks, moving away from what is currently considered safe assets into higher risk assets. So this is really a very important question to get right now. But I am certainly in the work that we're doing with businesses and financial players. There is much more attentiveness to this now, and much more interest in the opportunity that is coming from the development of these new industries, these new technologies, than is associated with the risk of, if you want, staying as we are. The balance is shifting, and companies are looking at how to invest with that opportunity in mind, albeit requiring a significant degree of policy support and reassurance that this is both the direction but the pace that is necessary. And there's a lot of enabling policy that needs to be maintained and indeed emphasized further for that to happen. But this, the balance is starting to shift potentially quite rapidly to the areas that we're talking about here, as long as we do it with a focus over the next couple of years or so. The moment is absolutely now to get this right. We won't have this amount of public funding directed again in the next 5 years, certainly, and maybe not in 10 years. So it's absolutely crucial we get this right now.
Yeah, and Martin, just to be clear, the areas where you think there's the highest risk of stranded assets, which are they?
Well, they are in either, higher carbon activities clearly are the ones where if we invest in infrastructure that will be outdated essentially within 10 or 15 years, rather than fit for purpose in 2040 or 2050, clearly that is a high risk now. Some of that infrastructure is possibly dual use and can be repurposed. So it's not necessarily black or white in every case, but there are areas of infrastructure and some technologies that we can see we need to gradually manage down and increase in other areas to compensate. So I think infrastructure is a key area to get right from that point of view. And we can see areas in respect of hydrogen and CCS, which were both mentioned, that we clearly need to increase infrastructure capacity and rapidly, but have in mind the end goal in 2050 when we're doing that, because we can overinvest as well as underinvest in some of these areas.
Yes, and just to be clear, when you mention dual-use infrastructure, you're actually referring to natural gas infrastructure, which can be repurposed for hydrogen. There was a question from the audience for Richard, and it is about hydrogen. And so I have this question here from Andres Baudemer, who asked, could you elaborate more on the role of hydrogen and probably scarce resources for green hydrogen? And related to that, there's another question about green hydrogen and power to liquids for hard to abate industrial sectors like aviation and maritime shipping. I think this is sort of a bundle of two questions. Maybe you can say a few words on that. What did your study find about the worthiness of these things?
So I think the most important thing to recognise is that decarbonisation is the main objective here, and it's not about electrification. So hopefully the sound's a bit better now. Is that right? I hope. So electrification is part of the solution, as is hydrogen contributing to that as well. What we've found with this study and with other studies is that where hydrogen is deployed often tends to be at the difficult sectors. So that is heavy goods vehicles, it is in industry, it is perhaps in countries where you've got heavy, very wide deployed networks of gas, which can be easily converted. So those are really important parts to that. And it's more important to think about hydrogen really from a demand perspective. You're aware, unless you've actually got hydrogen being used. And it's not necessarily just a case of it's all one or the other. There's new technologies coming out of Japan and China on hydrogen vehicles, which might mean that actually electric vehicles have some significant challenges in homes, and people go to petrol stations in the same way they do now to fill up using hydrogen. So that there is going to be a lot of innovation coming forward as well. And I think there is a risk if you get too concerned about stranded assets that you miss the point that innovation will also come along and mean that what you thought was a pathway will actually turn out to be another pathway. And that's why it's important that we identify it's about getting to the end game and recognize that they're way, way different turns. And you may make an investment that actually doesn't pay off because a greater new technology comes forward, which transforms a sector and makes it far easier.
Yep. And keeping with you, Richard, since the line is good right now, another question from the audience. What are the assumptions in the A3 study when it comes to CCS?
Yep, so so all of the technologies are able to compete on an equal basis based on a series of cost assumptions. Those cost assumptions come from a range of different sources, some of which were public, some of which were provided by Iberdrola, if this study was for them. And then, so for CCS, it's there. That's why you see in industry, especially where you've got process emissions. I mean, I always like to remind people that the process emissions, that's from cement, iron and steel, ceramics, all the rest of it. That in itself produced more CO2 than the original 5% economy-wide target. So, that you can't just think of people's homes. Industry and decarbonising industry is also got some significant challenges with lots of different technology options. I'm being impressed by some of the chemical companies really stepping up with their plans. They've been talking to us about how do you decarbonise. Can you electrify certain solutions? Where can we make greater use of hydrogen? So that there will be different solutions for different technologies.
Good. And one question that keeps coming as well, I see here in the feed, is a key one that we haven't really addressed now, which is the question of cost. Richard, the A3 study basically made the point that there was going to be a need for massive electrification. This is also consistent with what the European Commission is saying. How can you keep the costs of electrification down? And have you actually quantified the costs that this entails in the study?
So yeah, so in this particular study, because it is doing a least cost optimization. So as I said, it's doing all of the costs of converting people's homes. It's doing the costs associated with building all these renewables. It's balancing the electricity system to make sure you meet security of supply. So all of that's factored into it. But it is obviously factored based on each pathway by its own nature will give an outcome. So other studies we've done have also suggested alternative pathways or these different mixes of the pathways But the point is that they all get to the end game. And the benefits that I identified that Martin was referring to, like jobs, cleaner air, all of these things are important. There's one bit I would say is a lot of people are talking about, blending hydrogen into natural gas. Personally, I find that one a little bit more difficult to justify, and any investment that worries me as being a stranded asset, because you've still got unabated natural gas. What you need to be doing is working out how you get to a zero end game, and you've only got 30 years, and that's a technology. If it takes you 10 years to get it right and working, and then it was wasted because you should have been switching to hydrogen in the first place, that's one that I feel is a risk of being a stranded asset.
Thank you, Richard. Maybe let me put the question to Arthur Runge-Metzger now about the costs of the transition and the different options that are available. I mean, I understand from our exchanges that depending on the geography, countries in the north or in the south will maybe choose a different mix with different degrees of gasification or electrification. And so the different pathways will be different according to those geographies, and therefore the costs will be different. Arthur Runge-Metzger, is that something that the European Commission will look into as part of the impact assessment that is due in September?
Yes, I think the straight answer is yes. It is something that we will have to look into. Of course, we kind of often do not talk about costs. We talk about these are investments, in fact, investments into better buildings, into a better transport system, and these come with returns, even if at times the returns are coming in over a long period of time when you make the conversion. So it's not money lost, it's really money being invested into something that is going to give us prosperity in the future. And as part of the long-term strategy, you will have seen that we have estimated how much money would have to be invested in the economy in the coming years, in addition to the investment we are doing anyway into our economy. And that, I think, in terms of the scale of the funding, looks all right when we look at the recovery programs. So we would be able to cover practically all of the additional funding that is required. Just we need to make sure that it moves into the right direction. A second aspect to this is in terms of, are the economic incentives set right? And I picked up quite a number of questions on, yes, on one hand, electrification is part of the solution, but on the other hand, we also know that electricity is probably one of the most heavily taxed and levied goods that is circulating in the economy. And there comes the little word of reform, because we talk about recovery and reform. And that might be an area member states could look at, and that could have immediate impacts in the next 2 years when it comes to electricity prices. I think what we see is in some of the national plans, even member states are trying to reduce the cost of electricity to the consumers in order to make sure that the right choices are going to be taken. And that is certainly something that we want to look at when we review the Energy Taxation Directive. But that alone is not going to do the trick, because it is member states' national taxation programs and schemes that are having the major and the most impact here.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to the different regional approaches to the solutions, depending on north, south, for example, but also of legacy assets, is that something that the Commission has integrated into its methodologies?
Yes, of course. We are not, when we do these assessments, modeling a fantasy EU. It is very important that the exercise also Richard has been doing when you look at cost optimization, that it is as close as possible to reality in terms of the starting point, and that your assessments will be able to be scrutinized and calibrated to what is happening in the real world. And that means you need to look at the different starting points of member states. We are not starting from some kind of a wishful thinking, but we need to take matters from where they are right now and then take them forward. What is important in Europe is, and I think Richard and also Martin were mentioning that, is flexibility to make sure that in the end we will deliver the decarbonisation, the climate neutrality in a as cost efficient manner as possible. So we should be economical also with our resources in Europe. So that needs to be taken into account. But in terms of the policies that we are supporting, many of them are market-based policies that give price signals in order to allow for that flexibility and to make sure that we move into the right direction.
Good, thank you, Arthur, for that. I think we're reaching now the end of this event. Maybe I will ask each one of you to say a few concluding words, and I'll start with Martin Porter, who was last to speak in the initial round of statements. Martin Porter, maybe just in a few sentences, your main takeaway from this event.
Yes, actually, I'll just conclude by referring back to what Arthur said. I think the point that these are investment needs, not costs, is very, very important to emphasize. There is a clear short and longer term benefit that we will see, whether in the short term for employment reasons or longer term decarbonisation and health, as well as employment. That case, I think, is very well made, and we should make sure we reflect that in the way we discuss it. I think that the question about flexibility and regional variation is important from an EU perspective, because there is clearly a regional need to invest more heavily in certain regions, in certain industrial locations than others. Hence, we have funds which are set up to that purpose. There's also a generational question here, which I think is important. This is something that clearly affects different generations, and we need to bear that in mind in terms of solidarity. The last point I would make is one again mentioned briefly by Arthur, which is the link to the circular economy and making sure all of these policies are designed thinking about how we are resource efficient and manage the demand for resources in a way which enables us to achieve the decarbonisation efficiently as well. In industrial uses in particular, we can be more efficient with resources, and that will diminish the demand for energy and therefore reduce the need for some of the extent of whether it's electrification or other heat needs. And we need to do both together. It's not one or the other. We need to look at these two together. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Richard Sarsfield-Hall, maybe a few concluding words from you, your main takeaways from this discussion.
Yeah, thank you. My main message, and the message is, when we first started doing some of that main study and these other studies, we were honest, skeptical about how easy or can you get to net zero by 2050 without it becoming impossible and everything else. And what the pathways have been able to show is that you can do it. It's not impossible. You just need to get on and do it. So there's a Nike element to this, which is, you just need to make things happen rather than trying to second guess everything, because otherwise you'll never get there. If you're trying to design an optimal way of getting there, then the point is it won't be optimal, because when you get there, something else will have changed on the way. What's really important from a policy is set the aim and then allow innovation and allow everything else to actually get there with the appropriate incentives to make it happen, as Arthur was saying, by the timeframes that they need to. So when they commit to something, you commit to it and then get on with it.
That's clear. Arthur Runge-Metzger, maybe a few concluding words from your side, a few takeaways from the event.
I think, and I want to pick up from where Richard ended, because at the end of the day, the transformation we are talking about we need to carry with us all the European citizens, we need to carry with us all the European companies. And what I was very encouraged by over the last 12 to 18 months is how much the agenda of climate neutral Europe has been clicking on in many parts of the society. And my wish really is that people are not going to get desperate because of the Corona crisis, and that they don't shelve their plans, whether it is renovating your own house, whether it is investing in the clean technologies, in the clean processes in the future, but to try to be with us and to struggle with us to move forward so that we really get onto the right track towards 2050 climate neutrality. I think that is something that we need to keep in mind. We should not leave anybody behind in this battle in order to get to a clean world in the future.
Thank you, Arthur, and thanks to our audience for joining us today. These encouraging words from Arthur to conclude this online debate that I had the pleasure to moderate today. Our apologies again for sometimes the little mishaps with the connections. We're trying to improve that all the time. And we're hoping to see you online again in the coming days and weeks for more Euractiv online debates. Thank you all, and see you next time.
Thank you very much.